Okay, here we are.
Oh, we are.
Hello there, Mr. Jason. I am so glad to have you tonight.
Oh, thank you very much for this opportunity and excited to be in a space with you for the first time.
hmm Um, Before we even jump in, just a public thank you for your brilliance, for your willingness, for pushing my thought constructs through this thought process of even doing this. So thank you so much. Just had to publicly
Mm,
announce that. But yeah, we're gonna give a little bit of background and then we're gonna jump right on in.
I love it.
We are wrapping up Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Um, and I reached out because I felt it was a significant time to just like bring the conversation about of how are we creating a safe space, but doing that in the presence of a man, right? Like I think
Mm.
men to men vulnerability, men to men openness and awareness is so important. And so I came to you and I'm like, look, I got an idea and I want to do this, but I need you on board. I'm not doing this by myself. So thank you for that. So we tonight, I'll just give a little bit of introduction about myself. You can share your intro and we jump in. All right. So
Love it.
those of us that are not familiar with us, I am Denisha. I am a mental health counselor and private practice owner located in Tampa, Florida. I am out of all of the things, I'm in this space where I'm navigating what does vulnerability and support in not only in my personal life, but that has transformed in to a women's workshop that I just wrapped up. And I felt it was so necessary to also spread that message to the men that you guys also need support. You guys also deserve spaces of vulnerability. So here we are. Mr. Jason, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, super excited to be here. Jason Teeters. I run a small boutique consulting firm that really focuses on enhancing the performance and well-being of leaders and organizational teams. Really excited about just sharing my message of my own journey of becoming as it relates to mental health and well-being, and being a recent, probably in the last 4 or 5 years, a recent practitioner of focusing on my own mental health and well-being, and knowing that it's an ongoing practice. And so excited to be in a space with someone as professional as you, to be able to guide this conversation and be able to have an authentic conversation about mental health as it relates to men's well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. All right, so let's jump right into it. Tonight's topics, we have umbrellas of release, restore, and renew, right?
Mm,
When we think about like the outcome of self-renewal, we kind of think about like this glamorous idea of ourselves of like, this is the goal that I want to get to. This is the idea of self, but we don't really understand the trenches that you have to go through of shedding and releasing and finding proper ways to restore yourself so that you can get to that renewal state. So we're the first part of release. One is recognizing that a huge part of release is the essence of grief, right? So a little snippet that I wrote about release was releasing the past and coming to terms with grief is an essential journey in the human experience and a profound emotion that stems from loss of a significant person, place, thing, or idea. Now, I don't think that we capitalize the essence of lost hopes, lost dreams, lost ideas of self is also a form of grief, right? So
mm,
not only like
mm.
around this time of year of like seasonal depression where we're experiencing grieving like loved ones, we're also experiencing the grief of like who I didn't become this year that I wrote on my vision board in January of the beginning of the year. Um, or just like these failed notions that kind of went throughout the year in these different parts of myself, right? And so I wanted to highlight the essence of grief, especially in manhood, because there's 5 stages of grief. You have denial, which is like, I, I'm having trouble with even accepting this. right? Then
Yep.
maybe after I accept it, maybe I'm now in this space of depression. That's another stage. Another one is bargaining. I'm kind of like going back and forth with myself about this thing, or going back and forth with the idea of loss. I have anger. I'm pissed off that this loss has happened, right?
Yeah.
And then the last stage is acceptance. Now we can go through all five stages in like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
But it's understanding that a part of growing into who we are is accepting that we are going to hit all of those stages of grief of what we have to release. So can you share a little bit about just like any experience that you may have had in your journey of grief in itself?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really hit me as I started to go down this journey of mental well-being was this need to have a reflection, right? I often say the me to we, like I have to start with myself.
Mm,
And one of the things that you mentioned, if you think about all those five stages, the multiple times that those come into your day to day, right? And so the three things that stick out for me is one, a lot of personally my mental well-being and what I've researched really sort of um, gets laid across sort of three areas, right? The first is like my core identity, right? Like my ethnic group, my gender, my sexual orientation, like all these things make up my core identity. And in any of those, right, how I fit within my own expectations and reality takes me through those levels of grief, right? And
mm,
and then we start thinking about our core values, right? Religious and spiritual, right? Any of those, right? What my expectations are and where I'm at has an effect.
mhm.
And then the one that was really uh valuable for me to also pay attention to, that third one, is around role strains. Like what role do I play,
Ooh.
right? As a father, as a spouse, as a partner, as a co-worker. And then once again, my expectations of what I want to be and where I'm at. And so you take all those and internally we're trying to make these really quick adjustments to try to live up to this idea of what we think we should be. And then you add the extra like impact of also being told through society who we're supposed to be. And so a lot of times my own core identity or values may not align with what society is trying to say is the right one. And so now I already feel like I'm at a loss or I'm behind. And so every day it's like we're constantly like, and we're not even doing it consciously, but subconsciously we're constantly making oh, how am I as a dad? Oh, I'm not doing that great. I was terrible yesterday. How did I show up as work? Oh, I thought I was going to lose more weight, or I thought that I was like and like, and so when you think about those griefs, I think and those stages of grief, especially when we're talking about the barriers to men's mental health well-being, it requires me to take a deeper look of uh, uh, an intentional look at what my expectations are for me, what's the reality, and where I can find a happy medium, or where I'm completely off base, right? Like I don't want
Mm,
this thing the society is saying I want. I really want this thing, but I keep feeling this grief and stress and these challenges in my life because I don't have the Tesla, or I didn't go to this college,
mm.
or like me, I'm 5'7". Wish I was 6 foot. There's nothing I can do about that, right?
Yeah.
But every day, right, I wear that as like, I wish I was a little bit taller. Wish I was a baller, right? Like the song. But you have to find those ways to manage that grief.
And what I heard in it is like the armor of expectation, right? Like one of the barriers of, I feel, in men's well-being is like that persistence in carrying the load. So like if I'm wearing this armor of expectation, I'm not really setting aside the idea that my expectations is different than my standards. So my expectation is just like the plan to get there, right? The standard is the overall goal. So it's like, well, that shifted, that didn't happen. I lost that person, I lost that opportunity, but like I don't stop until I reach the overall goal. So one of the things that I wrote about release in reference to what you just said is grief can feel like an anchor holding us down in a sea of sorrow, right? It's perfectly normal to mourn. It's actually healthy to mourn, but holding on to grief for too long can stagnate our personal growth and idea of happiness.
Mm.
So I think in essence of release, it is the willingness to let go so that I can step into whatever reality is shifting me into anyway. I'm so busy holding on to this armor of expectation that I'm not willing to let go was literally pulling me underwater, literally like an anchor. Because I just won't let go of the weight so that I can just, come on, baby, let's float. Like
Yeah,
we all
let's just keep
connected.
going. Yeah, right. And and that's one of those things that's just so challenging. You know, the when I first started going through this process, I had a chance to uh, be in a space with men all focusing on mental health, and particularly for this one occasion of this story, they were all Black men, and I remember this like nervousness of holding space for all these men because look, I grew up in Indiana. I predominantly like white community, right? There's always this fear that I'm not black enough. And then
Mm,
here I am with all these like dope brothers from all around the world, and a couple of them are from LA. And we start getting in this conversation, and one of them said, you know, I've always had this feeling that I wasn't black enough.
mm,
And so now we have about 20 men that are doing amazing things all over the world in a space together, and all of us are saying the exact same thing. So even within our own like ethnic identity and culture, we feel like there's an expectation of what it means to be a brother, right?
yeah,
and
yeah.
and if you take race out of it and you just say men in general, right, there's this expectation that almost limits the possibilities of the full like spaciousness men can hold for each other, for their spouses, for their children, because of this limited view.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. So in reference to that is, if we're understanding that that is a capacity of it, the tool, because we got to give out tools for each one, because we can talk all day,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
you,
yeah.
so applying tools in this one is one. Okay, so one thing is doing your own idea of imagery, and what I mean by that
Mm,
is taking out the comparisons, taking out the messages that you got from like daddy and granddaddy of who you supposed to be. Like current day, if you could just put your own idea of imagery of
mm,
what do I define as manhood? What do I want that to look like? Who do I want to face in the mirror? Right? Because like
yeah,
we're not really facing the essence of reality. One, just based on, I don't even like the man that I am in the mirror. So who is that for you? Without shaming that, let's just identify and create who that is so that we can find the tools, right?
yeah,
So I think that that is a very intricate tool, but also in reference to that is giving yourself time to grieve, being patient with yourself. Like men being patient with themselves is so important, because if you become more flexible in the grace that you have with yourself, you give that grace to other people around you. So you're not so stern and like rigid with your family or your partner or your team at work, right? Like the there's power in you being willing to give grace to yourself.
Yeah.
So that goes
Well,
to the next one, which is restore, right? So, oh, now this is a big one because it's something that you touched on. I'll read what I put in restore. Releasing past, it requires courage, introspection, and unwavering commitment to rebuild. So
mm,
in these experiences, it's identifying like whether this is by force or choice. Now, what are the tools that I have to use to fill the gaps that was left from release?
yeah.
Because those are now voids that's there, right? So filling those voids, one thing that you said that I want to go back to is you said, like, what am I doing as a man? You don't really understand the essence of like being aside of doing. Now, I blame society and I blame the messages that have been transferred down into manhood, okay? But I think we put so much notion, and I give that also to women in society too. We give so much notion as a man's credibility of what he can do equates his manhood. And so y'all miss the essence of just like defining who you are because you're so focused on what you can do.
Yeah. Oof. Oof. So I love that. And the way uh that I'll move through that is, there's when I was doing this work and when I was doing my own work and as I was helping design a program to focus on mental health well-being for men, one of the things I came across is this idea of John Henryism.
Okay.
And so John Henry folklore, I think he's out of Virginia. Maybe we watched it when we were a kid or it's still around, but it's this idea of the still driving man. And John Harris, this big brother, and he was able to like one hit take the still right in the ground. And folklore goes is that somebody built a steam powered still driving machine, and there was this huge bet that John Henry can beat the still machine, right? And you can see this in folklore, and of course we know how it goes. John Henry ended up winning, right? He kept driving the electronic steel mill like fell out, or not electronic, the steel mill, steam power steel mill fell out. John Henry keeps going. He keeps going. Everybody's cheering. Everybody, ah. And then he eventually stops hammering and he dies.
Mm.
And the story that we're told when we were a kid is that his heart was so big, right? And he cared so much that his just heart couldn't last any longer. But what really changed for me is when you start putting that through the lens of the age-old story of man versus machine, right? AI versus our current work today. We see this time
Yeah.
and time again.
Mm-hmm.
And what John Henry's story has taught us is that our body's a tool. And so we use it as a tool until it wears out.
Mm.
And so, even for man, our self worth often is tied to what can I do, right? And I'll keep carrying, I'll keep pushing, right, to do. And we're burning out. And I think we're seeing it now, not only among men, but we're definitely seeing it in work culture after the pandemic. We definitely seen it, right? We're like, how can I expect my body, my mental well-being to keep at its fullest capacity if every day like I'm hitting bed and like my bar's on red and I don't
Yeah.
even get a full charge and I wake up and I do it over and over and over again. And so I think oftentimes, right, the big challenge, at least for me, in my experience, was to, like you said, give yourself grace, and that's really challenging because I, I have expectations for myself. We
Mm-hmm.
all do, right? And that's sort of the thing. Like I should have done 15 of these on my to-do list. I only did five. Right. But there's also this interesting. There's a poet by the name of he's on Instagram. Young Pablo, I think his name is. Uh, but he has this quote where he says, Our goal is to heal ourselves so that every person we come in contact with doesn't have to experience our trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we have to start to recognize that the true power of this like restoring is that that by you by you going through this process, right, you're now creating even like just in the practice of you working on yourself is completely changing the environment with which people engage with you because you're reacting and responding with yourself with grace. You're able to give others grace, and that's a challenging thing that doesn't happen overnight. It's one of those things that you're constantly going to be doing over and over again.
And see, here's what I hear in it. The challenge in that is you have to be emotionally aware enough to know that you need some type of intention in that space. Now, here's what I mean by that. So, like, okay, if I've been conditioned to feel that I'm a doer, and then I'm experiencing things like shame and blame and guilt because I'm not meeting these expectations of myself, a lot of men don't really have emotional awareness enough to know that me walking around angry is a secondary emotion. Meaning that if I like take a step back and realize like why I'm so irritable and why I'm so agitated and why I'm, if I get under that, it's shame, it's it's guilt, it's blame, it's insecurities, but we don't take the time to pour into the very thing that pushes the body, which is the brain. So if I'm not really pouring into that and I'm trying to escape it, going back to I'm feeling voids now, right? So whether
Yep.
any measures of escapism that's going to increase their dopamine, whether there's sex, drugs, alcohol, gambling, money, being an overachiever, like if I'm not paying attention to, there is an essence of me that is constantly trying to feel a void and escapism. I don't get to the root of, I need some help with this shame or this, because it's not just turning into burnout. It's literally turning into just outright depletion. Burnout is the experience of I can't put anything more into the activity of me.
Mm.
Depletion is I ain't got nothing else to give me. Like I ain't
Yeah.
got and so we're seeing men in like walking around in almost these corpses of themselves because their physicality is there, but they checked
Yeah.
out. And so this is where I say, how do we lean into accepting support or even being okay with the idea of support is a tool for restoration when there are spaces where maybe I do as a man feel inadequate or I do feel like I just don't know something that I feel I need to know.
Yeah. Man, there's a couple things that a couple points that you made that are sort of like trickling through my mind. I think the first is you make a you make a really solid point of like how do I recognize that in myself, right? And I would say I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of I feel that we're dealing with now as a society. You know, currently is like the real impact of mental health and well-being on us,
Mm-hmm.
and really starting to see that because I think it is hard for you to say, hey, you now know you need support and here's ways to do it. Go do these things that don't feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we have these conversations to get us to think differently? And I think one of the examples that I would give um, to show the example from men to women, right, is I think my wife, you know, we've had two kids, and I remember early at the birth of our first child, this immense like pressure I felt for my wife to feel like she had to know every single thing to be a mother. And
Mm,
there was this like, oh, did you read this article? Did you do
mm,
this? I'm
yeah.
watching large groups of women who ultimately just want to be the best mother for their child, but they're caught up in this cycle of depletion of like, how does it look when I do this, and what is it, and they're, and and so I often think about that, especially in this case, right, just to show the example of how uh subconsciously we're not to be thinking about the depletion that's happening when we're caught up with, why don't I have that car, why am I driving that, why am I angry right now, why am I upset, like, so there's this really interesting aspect of like, how do we get people to to stop and take notice
Mm-hmm.
around that, and 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 then how do you do it in a way that allows for you to not create the same type of environment that you created with what you started, right? And so, like, I think
Mm.
we see this all the time. I want to be healthy. Oh, I'm gonna go to the gym at 6 a.m. every day. Like, you go from one extreme to the next, and then that burns you out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And oh, well, guess what? I won't go to the gym. I'll just only eat twice a day, right? And you put these like strains and hoping. I think oftentimes for men, right, we get jarred out of that when there's a moment that comes up, right? Whether it be a spouse, whether it be an event, whether it be something where you catch yourself and you're like, oh, I don't want to be this person.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't have an intentional outlet to keep practicing this, right? Like we would if we were writing, reading, taking photography, study, whatever it is. Like if we don't have an intentional practice where we can work through these things, challenge these things, or have conversations around these things, then it makes it even harder to like not react, when what we really want to do is to be able to respond, to be able to like see something, take a mental check on the inside, and then be able to move forward with some sort of consideration about my own personal well-being as I start to move forward. And I think oftentimes for men, we'll notice it, we'll make an intention that we want to do better, but it doesn't show up the same way every time. So now we react to something that's exactly the same, but we never took the time intentionally to focus on why are we, what is our, like you said, the shame, the guilt, what is all this stuff underneath it that's actually exposing itself during those conversations.
Because I think the thing that I heard in that is, in order to even put forth the practice, the response to myself is a part of self-care is what's the language that I'm speaking to myself? Meaning, am I telling myself that I'm deserving of rest? Am I telling myself that I'm deserving of love? And am I telling myself that I'm deserving of support? Am I telling myself that I'm deserving to be poured into, right? My response to myself is the embracement of self-discovery, because I can't really discover the needs of me if I'm not sitting and accepting the deficiencies of me. Now, accepting does not excuse pain. I
Yep.
can, radical acceptance is accepting the good, the bad, the pretty, and the ugly, right? And so all of me is this space of self-compassion, but also very mindful awareness of how I'm even responding to myself in this. I think that takes us into I that in itself, I think, takes us into the space of self-renewal. Because just because we are putting these things into practice where we may be applying certain tools and finding ways to restore ourselves and seeking support, and that does not mean that self-renewal doesn't mean that you don't have to shed all over again. right? And so going back to one of the very first things that you mentioned about like these identities or these barriers to well-being is the identity shift. The renewal of me is looking at how am I applying these tools to the outcome of me. But the outcome of me goes into like my mindset shift and my image shift, which means I'm doing a whole transformation of identity here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's a couple of things that I think we'll get to here, but the my first response to that is also, do I feel cool in that new identity?
Mm,
Right? Because it's easy to say I want that shift, but I I also every nobody wants to feel out of the circle.
yeah, like the outcast.
Right. And so when you make that shift, and even for me, when I started going down this path, like I was a toxic positivity guy, right? Like, and I still am to this day, but
Dang.
but
Oh my
now
God.
but now I know where it comes from. I mean, look, 5 years ago I had friends that were battling with mental health and seeking therapy, and I would be in spaces with them just like, yo, dude, just think positive, right? Like I know the outcome's going to happen for me, and I just get, and not to be recognizing that also um, is a form of neglecting my own needs.
Dismissing
Right.
reality.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
and not to be recognizing it. So I learned right away that I was toxic positivity, and so a great example that I have of that is I remember when I about a year ago when I said, okay, I want to start learning more about gardening, and I
Mm.
want to start getting my hand in the soil. And I was doing this work around regenerative practices and organizations. And I found this calling. And I remember being like, oh, man, all the people I know that's doing like gardening are just like not cool.
Mm.
And then I went on this journey on Instagram where I was like, for me, I was like, show me some black gardeners. And I start finding all these like dope like gardeners from all over the world that were doing it in their way and making it look. And I was like, yes, like
Mm-hmm.
that's the type of gardener I want to be, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
it's that like when we go back to that, like the way society sort of places value and then our core identity and all these things, like when we make that shift, right? That shift not only has got to be for our well-being, but also for people to it feels like for people to create lasting effect, they also must align it to the things that they value. And I think oftentimes um, uh, mental health and well-being for men is never done in a way where it allows for open vulnerability. And
Oh.
so it's already a space where we're posturing and everybody I don't want to talk about it, but there's some really just through conversations, right? There's been some really beautiful moments where I've healed just by listening to other men share their challenges and stories, whether it be with their children or with their spouses, and you start to like, oh man, like you're like, this is what I'm noticing, this is what I'm seeing, and here's other ways to think about engaging. And so without those, right, it's impossible for us to think that we can will our mental health alone without having a community, because a part of our health and well-being is our community as well. And so to try to do it by yourself without a community makes it really challenging to have the confidence to do it, to stick to it, and to
Mm.
keep doing it.
So here's the counteracting it. Somebody taught y'all that suffering in silence was like cool and like a thing and like this badge of honor. And so how do I like this? Okay, what I heard in that is building authenticity in myself and the self-discovery in myself then promotes me to like build an authentic support system around me, right? So that even goes into like my social media feed, the things that I'm feeding myself,
Yep. What
right?
you're watching, what you're liking, what you're like.
Exactly.
You're on Twitter every night before bed. Oh, I don't know why I'm stressed when I go to bed at night.
For sure. And so if I'm looking at everything that's causing me to compare myself and causing me to judge myself, that's not my authentic space, right? So like building an authentic support system is not just the people that I can call on the phone or meet up with. It's what I pour into myself. But how do I even get to a point where I am building authentic support if my teaching of manhood is no, you shut up and you suffer in silence. Like, don't nobody need to know that you need help. Don't nobody need to know that you even want to change. You need to look like you have it under control, right? And so I think in that space, the power of understanding that building an authentic support system is the longevity of your livelihood.
Mm, mm.
If I'm around people that's just like maybe this was cool like back in the day. Right. But the
Yeah.
space that I have grown into, if it's not serving me anymore, ultimately it's affecting my livelihood. Because now I'm either having to diminish myself to show up to stay at the same playing field that you are, or I'm having to, right? Like it's so many accommodations that I may have to continue to make for myself just to make you feel okay with this relationship dynamic. So
Yeah. Sure.
how
Yeah.
do we build how do we build support if we're sitting in silence?
Yeah. Um, mm. So there's, one of the ways that I always, not always, but one of the ways that I think about it is, um, it starts by being authentic about being inauthentic, creates the possibilities for growth. And
Mm,
what I mean by that, oftentimes, uh, well, for me, in my experience, right, uh, I've been very inauthentic in 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 my interactions around certain things, right? So let's just say, um, we just talked about being a father,
yeah.
right? When I first became a father, right? Like I was very inauthentic in this, like, oh, I got this stuff figured out. Baby, no problem. You go out there, I got this 2-year-old, no problem, right? But the suffering inside of like, right, am I doing the right thing? Is
Mm-hmm.
this gonna give my baby the best opportunity at life? Is this right? And so the start of saying, and this is a conversation I had with my wife to give a really good example, is like, yo, I think I've been really inauthentic about being a father.
Yeah.
I thought I had this figured out. I thought I knew what I was supposed to do,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
And my guessing comes from my own personal trauma, things that I want to avoid because I don't want them to deal with that, not even recognizing if it's like adding a whole different trauma to them,
For
right?
sure.
But as soon as we had that conversation, it's yeah, me too.
Yes.
So let's come up with a plan. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, and I think we see this a lot of times, and especially um, from a leadership perspective, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think so many of um, our characteristics of being really strong, successful leaders oftentimes are built around these inauthentic conversations, right? Like this
Mm-hmm.
command and control. I have the knowledge, you don't, right? Listen, follow my rules, do all
Mm-hmm.
of this. And then we come into a place where it's like, oh, a pandemic, and now everything's changing, and leadership is like, what do
Right.
we do, right? And leadership's like, what do we do? And they've now have positioned themselves in a place that they're the one that's always had all the answers.
Yeah.
So there's no reason for me to help you figure out answers because you've kept me shut out for all these years.
Woo.
And I think you're right. And so we're seeing that the same way in this sort of space of like, right, if we start with, look, I don't know what I'm doing. Right.
Hmm.
I don't know why I yell every time my child leaves the door open.
Yeah.
I yell, "Are you born in a barn?" I mean, how long is
Yeah.
that statement going to be carried? Like through centuries? Like when by the time it stops, there won't be any barns around, and people are like, "What are
Hmm.
you talking about? Born in a
Yeah.
barn?"
What I hear in that is the battle of the ego versus humility. And I think we don't know what we know until we know, which means my ego may be driving the ship until something comes in and knocks me in a humbling effect. And so now I know that I need to humble myself so that I can lean into support, because if I don't, I'm a run this to the ground, right?
Yeah,
But we don't know that until sometimes, unfortunately, we have these pandemics of life. We have these catastrophic events that literally comes in and smacks your ego upside the head and says, sit down, we have to form a new operation.
yeah,
In itself, I think that goes back to renewal means breaking the foundation.
yeah. Oh,
You
without a doubt.
breaking the
You
foundation
got to
of
change
who
the
you are.
story.
And now I
Yeah,
literally have to go back to my roots. I got to reform
right.
all that I've known, all of these thought constructs,
Compost. Yeah,
to literally start all over again, to restore who I feel I need to be in my authenticity. But that means I might have to go back and like, we can't operate the same way that this belief system has been passed down in my family. And that's a lot to say, because I'm saying no to daddy's teachings, to granddaddy's teachings, to uncle's ways of doing,
yeah.
right? That's
To
a lot.
to and for young men, right? Like, I'm a little bit older, but I can see it still happening now. And I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. I sort of wish the same thing for my daughter to some extent. Let me explain. Um, I grew up with, Biggie and Tupac and DMX and Jay-Z and right. And so for me, that was reality in life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was like, yo, like you're telling me how I should be behaving or how I should be acting.
Yeah,
And so I'm like, and look, it goes throughout everything. It goes through military, it goes through politics, right? Like all of us have either had some group of individuals that have sort of shown us, but society wise, what a stand up man is, right? And
mm-hmm.
oftentimes, if we go back and look at some of those things, there's some real trauma and pain that's coming through that we weren't hip to, right? Like they were telling a story that was completely leaving out the things that they go through,
For sure.
and we carry that forward. And how do we go back and then say, yo, that's not me anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that was a real big challenging thing because one of the things that I started to think about is how often the songs I listened to in the 80s and 90s disparaged homosexuality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And gay men and lesbians and all these things that, right? When I look back at them, I'm like, oh, I can't, like, I listened to a song, I'm like, and I'm like, oh, what? Because I'm now more self aware of the words are being said as
Yeah.
what they're being used for and what I want for my life. And
Mm-hmm.
now they're incongruent, right? Like they're
Yeah.
going different paths, and I now start to see myself like changing in that way. And so so it's really challenging to let go of some of those things. And the the second part I would say that has been really a mind shift for me is I've been doing a lot of research around regenerative agriculture, right? And
Okay.
how do you get the soil, how do you create the conditions in the soil to be perfect for life to grow, right? Like for life to keep renewing, restoring, releasing. And there's been a lot of research done, and even practices that I'm doing within some of my clients where it's, you know, from a regenerative practices, like how do you create the conditions conducive for life to thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in ourselves, in our businesses, in our relationships, how are we creating the conditions to have the possibility of the life that you want at that moment? And that requires you to seed new ideas,
Mm-hmm.
sprout them, right? Bloom them, and then also take a moment to compost anything that's no longer working and let that get back into the soil so it can come back as new nutrients. And for many
Mm-hmm.
of us, we haven't done the composting. And so we're just adding and we're adding and we're taking these new things and we're taking these new things. But there's things that are no longer serve you in your day to day or in your relationships or in your communication that you just haven't had an opportunity to just be still and say why do I keep doing these things that aren't really helping me achieve the vision I have for myself.
Why? Because we don't empower the message that self-preservation for men is important. And so what I heard, that's what stillness is. Stillness is I am willing to acknowledge that I have to preserve myself. And again, that goes back into the actionary mindset. Sit down somewhere and just like breathe for a second.
Yeah.
But here's so okay. The essence of what I took from that is seed, sow, harvest. Now you can look at that
Yep.
psychologically, spiritually, how you want to do it. Okay. Seed, sow, harvest. The seeds that I sow, that is what I am going to reap. But here's where it comes into the psychoeducation approach. My actions are behaviors that turn into patterns, that turn into structure, it turns into character. Okay. Now, that's ultimately what we're saying. We're saying if I am wanting to reap a renewed version of who I am so that I can continue to pour into the generations after me, or continue life in my business, or continue life in my social circle, or continue wherever I'm trying to keep this going, it has to all start with the action. If I'm not intentional in doing these very necessary actions, behaviors that ultimately I'm trying to step out on a farmer's field and see outcome, but like I'm not, I haven't taken time to like plant the seeds by hand.
Yeah. Well, and being careful, right? Like, and this is fun, right? Because also understanding, which I think you and I were talking about, is of our relationship to change,
Yeah.
because most of our expectations are the reason why we're suffering.
For absolutely sure.
And so, right? And so even if you think about like the seeding and creating the habits, and the habits become structures, right? And I've like, boom, I've dialed it in, I've dialed it in, I've dialed it in. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh no, it's not at that building, it's at the next building. And I'm like, I just did
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff, right? Like instantly, right, we lose what we were, the whole point of what we're trying to do, which is to help us thrive. And what that
Yeah.
means is, how can you be open to the possibilities, right? Like, we don't even, oftentimes, and this is what I say about this work as men, like oftentimes we don't even know the possibilities we have for ourselves because our view of ourselves is so limited.
For sure.
And it's so based on expectations that either align to either past experiences or conversations or to future wants and needs. And we're never in the moment present with each
Hmm.
other to be able to see the possibilities in front of us. And so we'll get mad at somebody, like if it's at another place or if we got the wrong building or if I had my whole day planned out and the internet is getting fixed.
Hmm.
Right, like, right, here's a chance to really explore who you are, but oftentimes we've created such a structure that we've not even had the ability to be able to take the uniqueness of the day as what it is, because we can't control anything,
Right.
right? And so we're sitting here walking around every day like, I expect I leave my house at 7:45 and I'm gonna get to work at 8 o'clock. I expect that I'm gonna get a coffee when I get there. I expect that I'm gonna sit down and nobody's gonna bother me. There's a million things that will go wrong before any of that happens. But every day we wake up, expectations, expectations. Now I'm frustrated because I didn't meet those expectations.
Yeah. I the takeaway, and I want us to end off with just like our main takeaways from this
Yeah.
conversation. The takeaway that I have from all of this is, especially what you just said, the willingness to relinquish control
Mm,
is, I think, the underline of this whole process of releasing what's not in my control, restoring the things that I can obtain and work within my control, and renewing the parts of me that maybe I have felt have been out of control, but getting a grip on the reality of who I am. And I think as support systems, whether it's other men in your lives or women or your children, your it's giving grace to you guys in knowing that you don't have everything under control. Leadership does not mean control. That goes back to what you just said. And so I think we need to be very mindful of how we're going about the expectations that we have of you guys so that you can respond in grace as we are giving you grace and understanding that there are going to be some days where you just don't have it to give. There are going to be some answers that you don't, or some questions that you don't have the answers for. There are going to be some things where you need to take a step and go learn for yourself so that you can lead effectively. And so I think just as a woman in this space of creating a safe space for men, I think the tool that I can use for myself is continuing to push the notion of vulnerability, that you guys are human beings and not machines. That's my takeaway.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think this has been such a life-giving conversation, and my takeaway that I would want people to leave with is this idea around um, yeah, being authentic about being inauthentic. And what I mean, like, especially when it comes to this release, I think that there's things that you, for men, that you don't have to hold.
Mm.
We feel like, oh, there's things like, I want you to release that, because then that helps you like restore the the essence of who you are for yourself, for your partners that don't have to hold also those challenges and those things that you're doing um, and dealing with in your family and your coworkers, right? Like I want that. I want that for men, um, in this sort of compassionate warrior sort of mentality of like how do you bring that into this space? And the renewal for me is, you know, it's when I think about renewal of how do we shift this? And one of the things that I've been doing, which I think is how we even ran into each other and met, was around this idea that I learned a long time ago from a gentleman, Ryan Monday. He started Alchemy Health. It's a men's health uh, therapist. He called it Peloton for therapists for Black men. But check it out. He's an ex NFL football player. And him and I were having a conversation. And he said, you know, every man in some sort of capacity has their man card, right?
Mm,
Something that they will never be questioned as
mm,
being a man, right? So you can think
yeah.
of if you're a fisherman, if you're a hunter, if you're for me as an athlete, right? And he said, your goal is by the time you get on your deathbed, you shouldn't have any man cards left. And
Ooh.
what he means by that is every chance you get, use those cards to tell other men the importance of their own health and well-being, that they're loved, that they're needed, right, that they matter, and they can do all those things without competition and anger and us versus them mentality. they
Mhm,
could do they could do it and still be strong, graceful, and powerful at the same time. And so,
mhm,
I think this conversation, the release, restore, renewal, has really helped me uh, get back to that essence of there's power in this work.
mhm, There's power in affirming your roots.
Yeah.
That's
Mm.
the essence. Is there's power of affirming your roots, and roots is just structure. So I hope that this conversation is just helping someone without going out into the tasks of what you feel you need to do from this conversation. Just the restructuring of your mind, the restructuring of the feelings that you may have towards yourself, the restructuring of just the understanding of who you are. I hope that this has sown a seed for someone to really affirm who they are and the roots of who they
Mm.
are. So thank you so much, Jason. It has been an absolute pleasure. I am grateful to see how this is going to continue to flourish over time, what blossoms from the seeds that we're sowing in this. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for tuning in. Men that have been encouraged to seek support, feel free to reach out to either myself or Jason for resources. It doesn't have to be therapy. If that's not your cup of tea, that's not your cup of tea. And if you haven't tried it, you don't know if that's your cup of tea.
Yeah.
But if you
You
just
got me on here, right? I was
right.
like, is this a therapy session? I don't want to do that. No, just kidding. I'm not ready. I still got more healing to do.
No, but if you know that this conversation has just encouraged you to find your authentic support, please reach out. We are here to confidentially assist you in your journey and direct you to the appropriate space that you may feel you need. In all things, you guys be well, breathe through it, and we will see you next conversation. Bye.
Thank you so much for this.
No problem. Thank you. All right.